The relationship between Pope Francis and Donald Trump has always been marked by disagreements, particularly on issues like globalism, immigration, and Christian values, which both defend in distinct ways. Pope Francis, known for his more progressive stance, has consistently emphasized the importance of welcoming immigrants, fighting poverty, and promoting social justice. His approach has been an attempt to foster a more inclusive and compassionate global vision. In contrast, Donald Trump, with his more conservative and nationalist policies, has opposed many of these ideas, particularly regarding immigration, advocating for stricter borders, and prioritizing national interests over global concerns. These two leaders, both of great influence on the world stage, appear to be on opposite sides, both ideologically and spiritually. The conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump can also be seen within a prophetic framework that many believe is unfolding before our eyes. The divergences between the two leaders may be part of a greater battle described in various prophecies about the end times. Prophets throughout history, including those who based their teachings on biblical passages, have warned of a time of great division where the church and governments would clash over fundamental issues regarding spiritual and political direction for humanity. Some interpret this division as a reflection of a larger spiritual conflict, where the forces of good and evil, represented by different visions for the future, are in direct opposition. This confrontation, though seemingly political, could have deep implications for the direction of the Christian faith and the spiritual guidance of the masses in the end times. Beyond the political issues, the spiritual division is also palpable between followers of Pope Francis and those who support Donald Trump. For many Catholics, the Pope represents the highest authority and the spiritual guide of the Church, with his leadership being a beacon of morality and faith. However, there is a growing segment of Catholics and conservative Christians who feel that the Pope's leadership has strayed from the traditional teachings of the Church, seeking more liberal paths that compromise with the modern world. On the other hand, Trump is seen as a defender of traditional Christian values, with a strong base of support that values his stance on issues such as the right to life and preserving family values. This contrast in spiritual approaches has created a polarized scenario, where those who follow the Pope oppose those who view Trump as a leader who preserves Christian morality. Are we then facing the greatest spiritual battle of the last centuries? This is a legitimate question that is increasingly on the minds of many around the world. The divergences between Pope Francis and Donald Trump are not just political disputes, but represent something much deeper and more significant, something that points to the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. If we look at the scriptures and the warnings of past prophets, we can see that the division between spiritual and political leaders worldwide could be a clear sign that we are approaching a time of great spiritual and moral challenges. As tensions rise and the choices of each individual become more polarized, humanity will be called to take a stand on the issues that will define the future of the Christian faith and the world we live in. The big question remains: how will we respond to this impending spiritual battle? The relationship between Pope Francis and Donald Trump has been marked by a series of visible disagreements on a range of issues, with the most prominent being their stances on globalism, immigration, and the values they each uphold as central to Christianity. Pope Francis, a figure of progressive leadership in the Vatican, has consistently called for compassion and solidarity, particularly on the global stage. His frequent appeals for the welcoming of immigrants, his commitment to addressing poverty, and his advocacy for climate action are emblematic of his broader vision of a more inclusive world. On the other hand, Donald Trump has positioned himself as a defender of national interests, especially when it comes to issues like immigration, often promoting policies that protect borders and prioritize the welfare of the United States above international concerns. In this ideological standoff, Trump has rallied against what he perceives as the globalist agenda, while Pope Francis has pushed for greater cooperation between nations in solving global crises. These contrasting positions highlight not just a political divide, but also a deeper clash over how faith and moral authority should be exercised in the modern world. This apparent conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump raises important questions about the larger spiritual landscape we find ourselves in. Many have pointed to these tensions as part of a broader prophetic narrative, one that has been unfolding for centuries in the scriptures and other religious texts. Prophecies about the end times have often depicted a period of great division within the church, as well as between governments and the church itself. The concept of a spiritual battle for the soul of humanity is something that recurs in biblical prophecies, with many religious scholars interpreting these times as the fulfillment of ancient predictions. In this context, the clash between Pope Francis, who embodies the global progressive movement, and Donald Trump, who is seen as a defender of traditional conservative values, can be viewed as symbolic of this larger, more cosmic struggle between good and evil. As these two figures continue to exert their influence in the political and spiritual arenas, the question arises, are we witnessing the manifestation of a conflict that will define the fate of humanity in the years to come? The spiritual divide between those who follow Pope Francis and those who support Donald Trump is also deeply significant, as it reflects broader societal rifts in the Christian community. For many Catholics, Pope Francis represents not just a religious leader, but a moral compass for the world. His calls for social justice, environmental stewardship, and the embrace of marginalized communities are seen as an extension of the teachings of Christ, urging believers to adopt a more inclusive approach to the world around them. However, there is a growing faction within the Church that feels his leadership has compromised on traditional teachings, especially on issues like abortion, LGBTQ rights, and religious freedom. These conservatives view Trump as a defender of these traditional Christian values, someone who seeks to preserve what they see as the true foundations of the faith. This divide has created a spiritual chasm where each side views the other not only as politically different, but as spiritually misguided. The tension between these two camps speaks to a larger struggle within the Christian world, one that may be reaching a critical juncture. As the political and spiritual battles between figures like Pope Francis and Donald Trump continue to unfold, many are beginning to wonder whether we are on the cusp of the greatest spiritual conflict of the last centuries. If we examine the prophecies and warnings given throughout history, we see a consistent theme of impending division and tribulation that will challenge the very fabric of humanity. In many religious traditions, the final battle between good and evil is depicted as a time when humanity will be forced to make a choice between two opposing forces, one that seeks to bring unity, peace, and understanding, and another that aims to divide, conquer, and impose a vision of control. The conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump, though seemingly political in nature, can be seen as part of this larger spiritual warfare, with each side representing different visions for the future of humanity and the Church. As these tensions rise, it becomes clear that this battle is not just about politics, but about the very soul of humanity. How will we, as individuals and as a society, respond to these challenges? Are we prepared to confront the forces that seek to tear us apart, or will we find a way to bridge the divide and move forward in faith, unity, and love? The answer to these questions may hold the key to what lies ahead in the unfolding drama of the end times. The tension between Pope Francis and Donald Trump has been one of the most significant political and spiritual divides of our time. The differences between them are evident in their approaches to globalism, immigration, and the role of Christian values in the world today. Pope Francis, who has been a prominent voice on the global stage, advocates for a world where countries work together to address common issues such as poverty, climate change, and the refugee crisis. He frequently emphasizes the need for compassion, solidarity, and inclusivity in his speeches, positioning the Catholic Church as a force for peace and justice in the world. Conversely, Donald Trump's policies have centered on nationalism, emphasizing the importance of protecting national borders and prioritizing the needs of citizens over global concerns. His rhetoric often aligns with traditional conservative values, promoting a vision of a society rooted in self-reliance and traditional family structures. These starkly contrasting viewpoints have caused significant friction between the two leaders, not only politically but also spiritually, as their ideas about what it means to live a Christian life differ greatly. This division is not just a political issue, but one that is deeply embedded in prophetic teachings about the end of times. Religious scholars and prophetic figures have long predicted a period of spiritual upheaval, where the forces of good and evil would engage in a final battle for the soul of humanity. Many believe that the current global climate is a manifestation of this prophetic struggle, and the ideological divide between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is a clear example of this. First, I would like to invite you to subscribe to this channel, because here I will be sharing a prophetic message for your heart every day. And don't forget to comment below with your prayer request and tell me who you have been praying for in recent days. Your family, friends, for work, for healing, Leave your prayer request below, and along with your prayer request, let me know what country you're from so I can see which countries our message is reaching. Amen. The Pope, with his progressive stance on social issues, can be seen as a representative of the good that seeks to unify humanity under the banner of love and cooperation. On the other hand, Trump, who champions conservative Christian values, is viewed by many as someone standing against what they perceive as a secular, godless agenda that is spreading across the world. In the context of biblical prophecy, this division may be seen as a sign of the spiritual battles that will intensify as we approach the final days. The great clash between the Pope's vision of a compassionate, inclusive world and Trump's call for national sovereignty and traditional values can be viewed as part of a much larger narrative of prophecy that foretells a time of great division, moral conflict, and spiritual reckoning. What makes this conflict even more significant is the spiritual divide that it creates within the Christian community itself. For many Catholics and Christians around the world, the Pope is the spiritual leader who represents the voice of Christ on earth. His authority, according to Catholic doctrine, is absolute, and his teachings are considered infallible in matters of faith and morals. Pope Francis's progressive approach to issues such as climate change, immigration, and social justice has earned him widespread support, but it has also led to criticism from conservative factions within the Church. These groups feel that the Pope's liberal positions have strayed too far from traditional Catholic teachings and that his leadership undermines the Church's moral authority. This has led to a rise in support for conservative leaders like Donald Trump, who is seen as a defender of traditional Christian values. The divide between those who follow the Pope and those who support Trump has deepened over time, creating a rift within the Church and the broader Christian community. This division is not just a political one, it is a spiritual divide, with each side interpreting the path to salvation and moral truth in fundamentally different ways. As we look to the future, it becomes increasingly clear that we are standing on the brink of what may be the greatest spiritual battle of the last centuries. The conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is not just a political rivalry, it is a battle for the very soul of humanity. Prophecies about the end of times speak of a period when the forces of good and evil will clash in a final confrontation, and the choices made by individuals and nations will determine the outcome. The rift between these two powerful figures, one representing a global vision of unity and compassion, and the other advocating for a return to traditional values and national sovereignty, can be seen as a microcosm of the larger spiritual struggle that humanity will face. The question that we must ask ourselves is whether we will choose the path of unity, compassion, and faith, as represented by Pope Francis, or whether we will follow the path of division, nationalism, and self-interest, as represented by Donald Trump. This decision will not only determine the future of the Church, but will also have far-reaching consequences for the world as a whole. As the final days approach, it is crucial that we reflect on the spiritual implications of our choices and seek the guidance of faith to navigate these turbulent times. In the broader context of the Christian faith, the confrontation between Pope Francis and Donald Trump can be seen as an allegory for the larger spiritual war that will define the future of humanity. Prophets throughout history have warned that in the end times there would be a great division within the Church, and that the faithful would be called to make difficult choices between competing ideologies. The spiritual battle between Pope Francis and Trump represents the clash between two visions of the world, one that emphasizes inclusivity, justice, and cooperation, and the other that seeks to preserve traditional values and national identities. Both visions claim to represent the Christian faith, but they are fundamentally at odds with each other. As this conflict plays out, it is important to recognize that the choices made by individuals, leaders, and nations will shape the spiritual destiny of the world. Will we stand united in faith, or will we succumb to division and strife? The answer to this question may determine the fate of humanity as we approach the end of time. Ultimately, the battle between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is not just a political struggle. It is a reflection of the deeper spiritual conflicts that are playing out across the globe. As the world becomes more polarized, with ideologies clashing and nations becoming increasingly divided, it is easy to lose sight of the greater spiritual truth that lies at the heart of the Christian faith. The conflict between these two figures calls us to examine the direction in which we are heading as a global community. Are we moving toward a world that embodies the values of Christ, love, compassion, and unity, or are we heading toward a world where division, nationalism, and self-interest prevail? As we face the challenges of the modern world, it is essential that we look beyond the surface of political and ideological differences and recognize the larger spiritual battle that is unfolding before us. This is a time for deep reflection, prayer, and action, as the choices we make in the coming years will determine not only the future of the Church, but the fate of humanity itself. The public and ideological clash between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is more than a simple political disagreement. It represents a deeper spiritual divide that has captured the attention of the world. At the heart of their conflict is their vastly differing views on globalism, immigration, and the role of Christian values in shaping society. Pope Francis, in his role as the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics, advocates for a vision of the world where nations come together in a spirit of cooperation, addressing global issues like poverty, inequality, and climate change with compassion and solidarity. His emphasis on caring for the marginalized, particularly immigrants and refugees, reflects a commitment to the universal love that Christ taught. Conversely, Donald Trump's political philosophy is grounded in a vision of nationalism and sovereignty. He advocates for stricter immigration policies, prioritizing the protection of national borders and interests over international cooperation. This approach, while resonating with those who feel that their national identity is under threat from globalization, runs counter to the more global vision promoted by the Pope. The stark contrast in their political and moral ideologies is a reflection of the broader spiritual tensions that are playing out in the world today. Many religious scholars and followers of prophecy believe that the ideological and spiritual battle between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is not just a momentary political struggle, but part of a much larger cosmic conflict predicted in the scriptures. Prophecies about the end of times speak of a period when the forces of good and evil would clash in a final battle for the soul of humanity. This battle is not just political, but deeply spiritual, as it will involve the division of people along spiritual lines. In this context, Pope Francis and Donald Trump can be seen as representing two opposing forces. The Pope's vision of a compassionate, inclusive world where nations work together in solidarity aligns with the values of peace and love that are often associated with Christ's teachings. On the other hand, Trump's worldview, which focuses on national sovereignty and individual freedoms, represents a different vision of the world, one that emphasizes self-reliance and protection of tradition. This ideological battle can be seen as a microcosm of the larger struggle that the world faces in the lead-up to the final days. The division between these two leaders is symbolic of the broader rift between those who believe in unity, compassion, and global cooperation, and those who defend national interests, traditional values, and sovereignty at all costs. The division between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is not limited to political differences. It also represents a profound spiritual split within the Christian community. For millions of Catholics, the Pope is the moral leader, the earthly representative of Christ, whose teachings should guide the faithful toward a more just and compassionate world. Pope Francis's calls for social justice, environmental stewardship, and the defense of the poor and marginalized have earned him a reputation as a progressive force for change within the Church. However, his leadership has not been without controversy. Many conservative Christians, particularly those who support Donald Trump, view the Pope's stance on issues like immigration and climate change as too liberal and out of step with traditional Christian values. These conservatives feel that the Church should focus more on defending traditional beliefs and moral teachings, particularly on issues like abortion, marriage, and family life. This divide has created a rift within the Church, with some Catholics feeling alienated by the Pope's progressive agenda, while others see him as the voice of reason in a world that is becoming increasingly divided. The spiritual implications of this division are profound, as it reflects the broader polarization within Christianity itself. As the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump deepens, the question arises whether we are witnessing the early stages of the greatest spiritual battle of the last centuries. Many believers point to the growing polarization of the world as a sign that we are approaching the fulfillment of prophetic teachings regarding the end times. The Bible and other religious texts speak of a time when the forces of good and evil will be in direct confrontation, with each side striving to influence the hearts and minds of humanity. In this context, the ideological and spiritual divide between Pope Francis and Donald Trump can be seen as a symbol of this larger cosmic battle. The Pope's calls for peace, justice, and global cooperation align with the vision of a world where humanity comes together in the spirit of Christ's love. In contrast, Trump's emphasis on nationalism and individualism represents a world where personal freedoms and national sovereignty are prioritized above all else. This clash between two opposing visions for the future of humanity could be the prelude to a much larger spiritual confrontation, one that will determine the fate of the world in the final days. As tensions rise and the stakes grow higher, it is crucial to reflect on the spiritual implications of this divide and the role each of us will play in the unfolding drama of the end times. The ideological and spiritual divide between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is not just a passing political moment, but a reflection of deeper tensions that have been brewing for centuries within the Church and society at large. In many ways, their conflict is a reflection of the larger forces that are shaping the world today. On the one hand, there is a vision of a more inclusive, compassionate world where nations work together to address global problems, guided by the principles of love, justice, and peace. On the other hand, there is a vision of a world where nations prioritize their own interests, protect their borders, and defend traditional values against the perceived threats of globalization and secularism. These competing visions represent two different paths for humanity, one that embraces the values of Christ and seeks to create a more just and peaceful world, and another that focuses on self-preservation and the defense of individual freedoms. As the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump continues to unfold, it is important to recognize that this battle is not just about politics, but about the future of the world and the role of faith in shaping that future. The choices we make in the coming years will determine which vision of the world will prevail and which path humanity will choose. As we witness the growing conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump, it is essential to recognize the deeper spiritual and prophetic implications of this divide. The battle between these two leaders is not just about political ideology, but about the direction in which humanity is heading. In the prophecies of the end times, there is a recurring theme of division, conflict, and spiritual reckoning. The clash between Pope Francis and Trump can be seen as a symbol of the larger struggle between good and evil, where each side is fighting for control of the soul of humanity. The decisions we make in this time of division will have profound consequences for the future of the Church and the world as a whole. Are we prepared to face the spiritual challenges that lie ahead? Will we choose the path of unity, compassion, and faith, or will we succumb to division, nationalism, and self-interest? The answers to these questions will shape the spiritual destiny of humanity, and the outcome of this battle will determine the fate of the world in the final days. As we move forward, we must seek the guidance of faith and the wisdom of our spiritual leaders to help us navigate this uncertain time and ensure that we are on the right path to the kingdom of God. The conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is a microcosm of a larger shift in global spirituality, where the lines between politics and faith are becoming increasingly blurred. The issues at stake in this divide go beyond simple policy differences. They touch on the very nature of how we view the role of religion in the modern world. Pope Francis, in his papacy, has consistently called for the Church to adapt to the needs of the contemporary world, urging Catholics to embrace a global perspective that transcends national borders and sees humanity as interconnected. His calls for a globalization of solidarity have been central to his message, emphasizing that no person or nation can be excluded from the moral responsibilities of caring for the world's poor, suffering, and oppressed. On the other hand, Donald Trump's ideology is rooted in nationalism, where the preservation of national identity and sovereignty becomes the primary focus. This stark contrast in vision speaks to the deeper tension between globalism and nationalism, two forces that are increasingly vying for control in the spiritual and political spheres. This tension, although primarily political, carries deep spiritual undertones, revealing a fundamental clash in how we envision the future of the world. Whether through unity and shared global responsibility or through nationalistic separation and self-interest. As we delve deeper into the implications of the divide between Pope Francis and Donald Trump, we must consider the prophetic dimensions that many believe are embedded in this struggle. The Bible and other religious texts foretell a time of great turmoil and division in the world, where the forces of good and evil will engage in a final, all-encompassing battle. Many believers interpret the current conflict between these two leaders as a manifestation of these prophecies. The polarization seen in the world today, the growing chasm between those who advocate for global cooperation and those who defend national sovereignty, mirrors the biblical descriptions of the final days. In these prophecies, the Church is depicted as facing unprecedented challenges, both from within and outside, as it navigates a world where spiritual truths are increasingly contested. The Pope's progressive stance, advocating for global unity and justice, aligns with a vision of a church that transcends borders and brings people together in a spirit of compassion. On the other hand, Trump's emphasis on nationalism and individualism represents a darker, more divisive vision, one that prioritizes the protection of national identity over the well-being of humanity as a whole. This division, as it deepens, may be seen as a sign that we are entering the final stages of the spiritual struggle that will determine the fate of humanity. The influence of Pope Francis and Donald Trump extends far beyond the political realm, shaping the spiritual landscape of the world in profound ways. For millions of Christians, both figures embody different aspects of the faith, and the clash between them represents the larger struggle for the soul of the Church. Those who support Pope Francis see him as a beacon of hope and compassion in a world increasingly divided by nationalism, greed, and hatred. His calls for social justice, economic equality, and environmental protection resonate with those who believe that Christianity should be a force for positive change in the world. In contrast, Trump's supporters view him as a defender of traditional Christian values, someone who upholds the sanctity of life, marriage, and family. They see in him a leader who stands against the moral decay of society and seeks to preserve the values that they believe are foundational to the faith. This division within the Church is indicative of a broader spiritual fracture, where different interpretations of Christianity and its role in the world are at odds. As these tensions continue to escalate, it is essential to recognize the spiritual ramifications of this conflict and to ask ourselves what kind of future we want for the Church and the world. The increasing polarization between Pope Francis and Donald Trump serves as a poignant reminder of the spiritual battles that lie ahead. These battles are not just political, they are deeply rooted in the struggle between the forces of good and evil, which will play out on the global stage in the years to come. As the world becomes more divided, with different nations and ideologies competing for power, the Church will find itself at the center of this conflict, called upon to navigate these turbulent times with faith, wisdom, and discernment. In the prophecies of the end times, the Church is portrayed as a beacon of hope and light in the midst of darkness and chaos. However, in order to fulfill this role, it must remain steadfast in its commitment to the teachings of Christ, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump highlights the importance of maintaining spiritual integrity and discernment in the midst of a world that is increasingly divided. It calls us to reflect on the values that truly define our faith and to consider how we can contribute to a world that is in desperate need of healing, unity, and love. As the final days approach, the question of which vision for the future will ultimately prevail becomes increasingly urgent. Will we choose a world that is defined by division, nationalism, and the pursuit of individual interests, as represented by figures like Donald Trump? Or will we choose a world that is grounded in compassion, solidarity, and the pursuit of global justice, as advocated by Pope Francis? This is the ultimate challenge of our time, to determine the path that humanity will take as we approach the culmination of the end times. The choices we make in the coming years will have far-reaching consequences, not just for the Church, but for the entire world. We must ask ourselves what kind of world we want to live in, and what kind of legacy we wish to leave for future generations. The clash between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is more than just a political battle. It is a reflection of the larger spiritual struggle that will define the future of humanity. It is up to each of us to decide where we stand in this battle and what role we will play in the unfolding drama of the end times. The conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump may seem like a political struggle, but at its core, it is a spiritual conflict that goes beyond national borders and political ideologies. It is a conflict that challenges the very nature of Christianity and its role in the modern world. As we face an increasingly uncertain future, it is crucial to remember that the decisions we make today will shape the spiritual destiny of the world. The division between Pope Francis and Trump is just one manifestation of the larger spiritual forces at play in the world today, and it is up to us to choose which side we will stand on. Will we choose the path of unity, compassion, and justice, or will we embrace division, nationalism, and self-interest? The outcome of this battle will determine the future of humanity and the fate of the Church in the final days. As we move forward, let us seek the guidance of faith, prayer, and discernment to help us navigate the challenges ahead and make choices that will bring us closer to the light of Christ. As we witness the ongoing divergence between Pope Francis and Donald Trump, it's essential to understand the broader implications of their stances, not only on a political level, but also on a deeply spiritual and prophetic level. The clash between their ideologies is not just about their differing opinions on globalism or immigration, but it's about what these disagreements signify in the context of the larger narrative of human history. For many, this division represents a manifestation of the fulfillment of biblical prophecies that foretell a time of great tribulation and moral crisis. In this context, the disagreement between the Pope's advocacy for unity, global cooperation, and inclusivity, and Trump's emphasis on sovereignty, nationalism, and conservative values becomes more than just a political dispute. It becomes a symbol of the forces of light and darkness at war for the soul of humanity. Whether it is the fight for environmental justice, the treatment of the marginalized, or the preservation of traditional values, the choices made by leaders like Pope Francis and Donald Trump are significant markers in a larger spiritual battle that will ultimately define the fate of the Church and the world as we know it. The tension between Pope Francis and Donald Trump also reflects a larger crisis in Christian leadership. Historically, the role of the Church has been to guide the faithful through the challenges of the world, offering a moral compass rooted in the teachings of Christ. However, in the modern era, this guidance has become increasingly difficult to navigate as political ideologies become more polarized. The Pope, as the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, is seen by many as a moral authority, one whose leadership should transcend political divisions. Yet his progressive stance on global issues, including climate change and immigration, has alienated a portion of the Church's faithful, especially those who align more with conservative ideologies. This division within the Church mirrors a larger fracture within the broader Christian community. On the other hand, figures like Donald Trump are seen by their supporters as champions of traditional Christian values, offering an alternative to what they perceive as a liberal drift in the Church and the broader society. This tension within Christianity represents not just a clash of political ideologies, but a deeper theological conflict, one that questions the direction of the Church, the nature of Christian witness in the modern world, and the very essence of what it means to follow Christ. As we analyze the prophetic implications of the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump, it's important to consider the role of the Church in the end times. Many biblical scholars and theologians point to the role of the Church in the final days as being central to the unfolding of human history. The division between Pope Francis and those who support Trump can be seen as a fulfillment of these prophecies, where the Church itself will face significant challenges from both within and outside its walls. This period of conflict is often referred to as the time of the Great Apostasy, in which many will depart from the true teachings of Christ, and the faithful will be tested by trials and tribulations. In this context, the Pope's leadership may be viewed by some as a sign of hope and spiritual renewal, while for others it represents a departure from what they perceive as the true teachings of Christianity. This growing division reflects a deeper spiritual battle, where the very essence of Christian faith and practice is at stake. The Church's response to these challenges will have far-reaching consequences, not just for the Catholic Church, but for the entire Christian world. How the Church navigates this crisis may determine its role in the future and its ability to remain a beacon of light in a world descending into darkness. The growing ideological divide between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is a reflection of the larger global struggle for spiritual and moral authority. As the world becomes more divided, so too does the Christian community, with different factions vying for influence and leadership. The consequences of this spiritual divide extend far beyond individual political agendas and touch upon the core of humanity's moral and spiritual identity. The tension between globalism and nationalism, inclusivity and exclusivity, cooperation and self-interest, are all moral and spiritual choices that will shape the course of history. The decisions made by leaders like Pope Francis and Donald Trump in the coming years will set the tone for the future of humanity. These decisions are not just political, they are deeply spiritual in nature, and their impact will resonate for generations to come. As Christians, we are called to examine where we stand in this great conflict and how our choices will reflect the teachings of Christ. Will we embrace a future of unity, compassion, and justice, or will we follow a path that leads to greater division, strife, and spiritual decay? This is the challenge of our time, a challenge that calls for profound spiritual discernment and moral courage. Looking ahead, the significance of the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump may take on even greater urgency as the world continues to navigate unprecedented challenges. Global crises, such as the ongoing climate emergency, the rise of authoritarianism, the displacement of millions of people due to war and famine, and the erosion of democratic institutions, are all contributing factors that intensify the ideological divide between different political and spiritual leaders. In times of crisis, people often look to religious leaders for guidance, and in this context, the role of the Pope and figures like Donald Trump becomes even more pronounced. As the world grows more polarized, the choice between the two visions they represent, one of global cooperation and shared responsibility, and the other of nationalism and traditional values, becomes ever more critical. The battle between these two leaders is not just a personal conflict, it is a reflection of the larger spiritual and moral choices that humanity must make in order to ensure a just and sustainable future. It is a test of faith, moral clarity, and the ability to navigate a world that is increasingly difficult to understand and reconcile. The unfolding drama between Pope Francis and Donald Trump serves as a reminder that the choices we make as individuals, communities, and nations have profound spiritual implications. It is easy to see this conflict as just another political battle, but in reality, it is a much deeper struggle that involves the very heart of humanity's spiritual journey. As we stand at the crossroads of history, we are faced with a choice. Do we continue down the path of division and self-interest, or do we embrace a new vision of unity, love, and faith? The teachings of Christ have always called for a radical love and a commitment to justice, but these teachings have often been challenged by worldly powers and ideologies. The current conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump highlights the timeless struggle between the values of the Kingdom of God and the values of the world. It is a battle that will continue to unfold in the years ahead, and it is one that each of us must choose to be a part of. The way we respond to this challenge will determine the kind of world we leave for future generations, and it will shape the spiritual trajectory of humanity in the final days. As we move forward in this critical moment of history, it is essential to reflect on the deeper meaning behind the divisions we see in the world today. The conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is just one manifestation of a much larger spiritual struggle, one that has been foretold for centuries in prophecies from different religious traditions. The divide between these two figures symbolizes the larger forces that are shaping the future of humanity, forces that will either lead us toward greater unity and justice or toward greater division and strife. As we face the challenges of the coming years, it is crucial that we approach them with a spirit of discernment, prayer, and faith. We must recognize that the choices we make in these critical moments will have far-reaching consequences, not just for the Church, but for the entire world. In the face of uncertainty and turmoil, we must turn to the teachings of Christ, seeking guidance, strength, and wisdom to navigate the battles ahead. The time is now to stand firm in our faith, to embrace the values of love, justice, and peace, and to be a light in a world that desperately needs healing. The struggle between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is emblematic of the greater global tensions that are shaping our future. These two leaders, though seemingly at odds, are not simply battling over political ideologies. They are engaging in a much larger spiritual war that transcends borders and national interests. The disagreement between them is deeply tied to the divergent paths humanity could take, one of global unity, shared responsibility, and compassion, as represented by the Pope, and one of nationalism, individualism, and a focus on self-preservation, as represented by Trump. This clash of ideologies is about more than just policy. It's about the kind of world we wish to build, and the kind of values we want to pass on to future generations. As we look to the future, we must recognize that these battles are not isolated to the realm of politics, but are deeply intertwined with spiritual and moral decisions. The choices we make now, whether to follow the path of unity and cooperation, or to embrace isolation and division, will determine the kind of world our children and grandchildren will inherit. Pope Francis and Donald Trump, though on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, both carry profound spiritual significance. For many Christians, the Pope is seen as a shepherd, leading the faithful through a world of growing uncertainty and chaos. His advocacy for global cooperation, environmental justice, and social welfare resonates with those who believe that the Church should be a force for good, transcending national interests and embracing the dignity of every human being. On the other hand, Donald Trump's appeal lies in his steadfast commitment to the protection of traditional values, national sovereignty, and the defense of what many consider to be the moral fabric of society. For Trump's supporters, he is seen as a defender of the Christian way of life, someone who challenges the secular world and stands firm in the face of political correctness. Both figures, in their own way, have come to represent contrasting visions of what it means to live out the Christian faith in the modern world. This tension between them is reflective of the larger spiritual battle that is currently unfolding within the Church and across the globe. The spiritual conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump also highlights the ongoing struggle between the values of the kingdom of God and the values of the world. Jesus taught that his kingdom was not of this world, that his followers were called to live by a different set of values. Values that prioritized love, forgiveness, and self-sacrifice over power, prestige, and wealth. In contrast, the world often encourages the pursuit of individual gain, self-interest, and the consolidation of power. The vision of Pope Francis aligns more closely with the values of the kingdom as he calls for solidarity, humility, and care for the least among us. On the other hand, Trump's worldview, which emphasizes nationalism and self-reliance, often echoes the values of a world that prioritizes individual success and national interests above the collective good. This spiritual divide is not just a matter of political affiliation, it is a matter of the heart and soul of humanity. As Christians, we must ask ourselves which vision reflects the teachings of Christ, and how will we, as individuals and communities, respond to these challenges? As the world becomes more fragmented, with political polarization and social unrest on the rise, the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump could be a sign of the larger spiritual crisis that humanity is facing. Prophecies about the end times often describe a time of great division, where people will be forced to choose sides, to stand for truth or follow the path of deceit. This division, both in the church and in the world, is not just a political reality, it is a spiritual reality that will require each person to decide where they stand. The battle between Pope Francis and Donald Trump may seem like a clash between two powerful figures, but it is also a reflection of the deeper spiritual battle that is taking place within the hearts of every believer. The choice between the Pope's call for global cooperation and compassion and Trump's call for national pride and self-preservation is a choice that mirrors the spiritual struggle between the forces of good and evil, unity and division, light and darkness. It is important to recognize that the spiritual implications of this conflict extend far beyond the individuals involved. The divide between Pope Francis and Donald Trump reflects a larger moral and spiritual divide within society, where different visions of the future are in conflict. These visions are not merely political, they are deeply rooted in spiritual beliefs and values that guide the way people live their lives. As the world grapples with issues such as climate change, poverty, inequality and migration, the choices made by leaders like Pope Francis and Donald Trump will have lasting consequences for the future of humanity. Will we choose a path that seeks to bring people together in mutual understanding and solidarity, or will we choose a path that divides us, where the interests of one group are placed above those of others? This is the choice that we must face in the coming years, and it is one that will shape the world for generations to come. The confrontation between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is part of a larger prophetic narrative that has been unfolding throughout human history. In many religious traditions, the final days are described as a time when humanity will face a great test, a time when the forces of good and evil will clash in a final showdown. In this context, the ideological and spiritual divide between these two leaders can be seen as part of the larger cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Throughout the Bible and other religious texts, we are warned of the dangers of division, of following false leaders, and of putting our trust in worldly power. The message is clear. Those who align themselves with the values of the kingdom of God will be tested, but they will ultimately triumph. Those who choose the values of the world, on the other hand, will find themselves on the losing side of this great spiritual battle. As Christians, we must take this message seriously, recognizing that the choices we make today will determine our role in this final showdown. As we consider the future of the Church and the world, the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump offers us a moment of reflection on where we stand in this great spiritual struggle. The division within the Church, the division in society, and the divisions between nations are all reflections of the deeper spiritual conflict that is taking place on a cosmic level. As Christians, we are called to be peacemakers, to bring unity where there is division, and to be a light in the darkness. But we must also recognize that this will not come without sacrifice. The path to unity, compassion, and justice is not easy. It requires courage, faith, and a willingness to stand firm in the face of opposition. As we move forward, we must ask ourselves, which path will we choose? Will we follow the teachings of Christ, as represented by the Pope's vision of global cooperation, or will we embrace the values of nationalism, individualism, and self-preservation, as represented by Trump? The decision we make will shape our future and determine our place in the unfolding drama of the end times. The spiritual significance of the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump cannot be overstated. This is not just a political battle, it is a battle for the very soul of humanity. As the world continues to face unprecedented challenges, from environmental crises to social and political unrest, the choices made by leaders like Pope Francis and Donald Trump will shape the future of the Church and the world. These choices are not just political or ideological, they are spiritual decisions that will determine the moral direction of humanity. In the end, the question we must all answer is, who do we follow? Do we follow the path of Christ, a path that calls us to love our neighbors, to care for the poor and marginalized, and to work for peace and justice? Or do we follow a path that puts national interests, personal gain, and self-preservation above the common good? The time to make this decision is now, as the world stands at a crossroads. The future of humanity depends on the choices we make today. The ideological battle between Pope Francis and Donald Trump underscores a deeper, often unspoken conflict that exists within modern Christianity. For many, the Pope's position is one of moral authority and spiritual guidance. His calls for inclusivity, social justice, and environmental stewardship reflect a Christ-like compassion for the poor, the oppressed, and the vulnerable. However, this stance has been increasingly criticized by those who feel the Pope is straying too far from traditional Catholic doctrines. They argue that the Church should focus more on the preservation of Christian values and the moral teachings of Scripture, rather than aligning itself with globalist movements and secular concerns. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has positioned himself as a champion of these traditional values, values rooted in biblical teachings about the sanctity of life, the importance of the family unit, and the moral responsibility of nations to protect their people. The division between these two powerful figures within the Christian community signals a larger rift, a growing tension between the desire for unity, compassion, and global cooperation, and the yearning for a return to national sovereignty, traditionalism, and a defense of cultural and religious identity. This conflict goes beyond personalities and policies. It reflects the profound spiritual struggles that all believers must face in the modern world. The message of Christ was one of radical love, forgiveness, and humility, values that transcend national borders and political ideologies. In the Gospel, Jesus calls his followers to embrace the stranger, to love their enemies, and to seek peace in a world that is often hostile to these ideals. Pope Francis, in his leadership, strives to carry this message forward, calling for global solidarity and compassion for those who are most in need. However, the growing popularity of figures like Donald Trump reveals a widespread disillusionment with the idea of globalism and an increasing desire for a return to a more insular, self-reliant vision of society. This rising tide of nationalism, bolstered by populist movements around the world, seeks to restore what is perceived to be the moral fabric of society, which is viewed as being in decline. This ideological shift has significant spiritual implications, as it presents a challenge to the universal nature of Christian love and calls into question the Church's ability to speak to the global issues of poverty, migration, and environmental degradation. In many ways, the clash between Pope Francis and Donald Trump reflects a deeper spiritual crossroads for the Christian faith. Christianity, at its core, is meant to be a force for transformation, one that calls believers to rise above the divisions of the world and embrace a higher calling. The divide between the Pope's progressive stance and Trump's conservative vision is not just a political debate, but a question of what it means to truly follow Christ in today's world. Is Christianity a call to universal love and inclusivity, or is it a call to defend traditional values and national identity? Can these two visions coexist, or is one inherently at odds with the other? The spiritual and moral choices facing Christians today are profound and far-reaching. As the world becomes more polarized and as global challenges continue to mount, the Church's role in navigating these crises will be tested. Can the Pope's vision of a compassionate global Church stand against the forces of nationalism and self-interest? Or will the Church divide along political lines, echoing the wider divisions of society? This question is not only theological, it is existential, and it will determine the course of Christianity in the coming decades. As the prophetic landscape of the world continues to unfold, we are faced with a deeper challenge than simply choosing political leaders or sides in debates over national and global policies. The true challenge lies in discerning the spiritual trajectory of humanity in the midst of unprecedented change. The increasing divide between figures like Pope Francis and Donald Trump may very well signal a larger spiritual crisis in the world, one where the Church must find its voice in an age of deepening moral relativism and political polarization. While the Pope's calls for global cooperation and solidarity may seem like a beacon of hope, they also come at a time when many believers feel disillusioned by what they perceive as a loss of Christian values in the face of secularism and globalism. Meanwhile, the rise of nationalist leaders like Trump has sparked a reactionary movement that seeks to reclaim traditional Christian values as a way of resisting the perceived moral decay of society. This tension is not simply about political ideology. It is a struggle over the very nature of what it means to be Christian in today's world. The question that emerges from this ongoing struggle is one of spiritual identity. What does it mean to be a Christian in a world where ideologies are increasingly in conflict? As the divisions between Pope Francis and Donald Trump continue to deepen, Christians must decide where they stand in relation to the values that each leader represents. Do they stand with Pope Francis, who calls for compassion, unity, and a broader vision of social justice? Or do they align with Trump's emphasis on the preservation of national identity, traditional family values, and personal responsibility? The spiritual implications of this decision are profound, as each choice reflects a different understanding of the role of Christianity in the world. One path calls for a radical love that transcends borders and embraces the suffering of others, while the other emphasizes the importance of self-preservation and the protection of traditional values. Both visions claim to reflect the teachings of Christ, but they diverge significantly in their interpretation of what it means to live out the faith in the modern world. As Christians, we are called to be in the world, but not of it, to live as citizens of a higher kingdom while navigating the complexities of earthly existence. The division between Pope Francis and Donald Trump reflects the tension between these two aspects of the Christian life: the call to live in the world with compassion and justice, and the call to preserve and defend what is seen as the moral and cultural inheritance of past generations. This tension is especially evident in the debate surrounding issues like immigration, environmental stewardship, and the sanctity of life. Pope Francis calls for a more inclusive, compassionate world where we acknowledge our shared humanity and care for the most vulnerable among us. Donald Trump, on the other hand, advocates for policies that prioritize the needs and interests of the nation-state, often at the expense of the global good. This division, while political on the surface, is ultimately a spiritual struggle that challenges Christians to reflect on their values and to choose where they will stand in the battle for the soul of humanity. In the end, the ultimate question for Christians today is not simply which leader to follow, but which vision of Christianity we choose to embrace. The growing divide between Pope Francis and Donald Trump reflects a larger struggle over the very nature of the faith itself. Is Christianity about embracing the world with open arms, seeking to heal and transform it through love and compassion? Or is it about preserving a particular set of values, protecting cultural identity and resisting the perceived moral decay of society. As the world continues to change, these questions will only become more pressing. The choices we make today, both individually and collectively, will shape the future of the Church and the role that Christianity plays in the world. Will we be a church that embraces the values of global solidarity and justice, or will we retreat into a more insular, nationalistic vision that prioritizes self-interest over the common good? The answer to this question will determine the legacy of Christianity in the world for generations to come. It is a spiritual crossroads, and the path we choose will define the course of human history in the years ahead. In conclusion, the conflict between Pope Francis and Donald Trump is a reflection of a much larger spiritual battle that is unfolding across the world. This battle is not simply about political ideologies or national interests. It is a struggle for the soul of humanity. The choices we make in this time of division will shape the future of the Church and the world. As Christians, we must be vigilant, discerning, and prayerful as we navigate these turbulent times. The prophetic signs are clear. The forces of division, nationalism, and self-interest are rising, but so too are the forces of love, unity, and justice. The question remains, which side will we choose? Will we follow the path of compassion and solidarity, or will we align ourselves with the forces of separation and isolation? The outcome of this spiritual struggle will determine the course of human history and the future of the Christian faith in the final days.